The Lost Dog. Johnny looked out of the window of the Red Hat's house into the dark night outside. "Has it stopped raining yet?" asked Jennifer. "I think so," said Johnny. "It is so dark that I can't see very much." Roger opened the door and looked out. "It has stopped," he said, "but I think it will rain again soon. There are no stars out." It had been raining for 3 days in the village with 3 corners. "We must go home now," said Jennifer. "If the rain has stopped, Grandmother will be looking out for us." "All right," said Johnny. "See you in the morning, Roger." Rip ran out of the open door into the road. "Come back, Rip," called Roger. Rip ran back into the house. "Rip is frightened of the river now," said Roger. "The water rushes so, and the river is very high." Jennifer and Johnny went out into the road. It seemed very dark outside, after the bright light in the house. The sky was black, and there was no moon. The Red Hat's house was not far from the bridge, and they could hear the river rushing by in the dark. "Look," said Jennifer. "There is a little red light on the road by the bridge." "There must be something there," said Johnny. "Let's go and look." They went along to the bridge, splashing in the puddles in the dark. There was a lantern standing on the road by the bridge. It shone red. "Why have they left a lantern here?" asked Jennifer. "I don't know," said Johnny. They went on to the bridge and looked down at the river. The water was so black that they could only just see it as it rushed along. They were going down to the road on the other side of the bridge when Johnny cried, "Stop! Look!" They stopped. There was no road at all, only the black rushing river for as far as they could see. They stood looking at the river for some time. Jennifer felt a little frightened. "I see why Rip doesn't like it," she said. "Let's go back and tell Grandfather." They turned back over the bridge, past the red lantern, and splashed up the road to the village. "Where is Grandfather?" cried Jennifer as they opened the door into the house. "The river is over the road by the bridge, and there is a red lantern there to tell you not to go on." "Is there?" said Grandmother. "I hope Grandfather is all right. He went out to help the men up at High Lake." Just then they heard Grandfather behind them. He shook off the rain and came into the house. "The river is over the road by the bridge, Grandfather," said Jennifer. Grandfather nodded. "I know," he said. "The water is very high. I have been up with the men at High Lake, putting bags of sand on the bank up there. If that bank gives way, we shall have a bad flood." As Johnny and Jennifer went up to bed, it began to rain again. They could hear the rain as it ran down the roof of the house, making little rivers down the windows and splashing into the garden. "I hope the rain stops before morning," said Jennifer. Johnny had been asleep for some time when he heard someone banging at the door of the house. He sat up in bed. He heard Grandfather Yellowhat go down to the door. The door slammed and someone came into the house. Johnny slipped out of bed and went down. Roger Redhat was there with Grandfather. He looked very wet. Grandfather turned round. "Hello, Johnny," he said. "Roger is going to stay with us tonight. The riverbank broke up at High Lake and the river is in flood." "And I've lost Rip, Johnny," cried Roger. "I've lost Rip." "Where was Rip?" asked Grandfather. "He was in the house with me," said Roger, "and all the water came right into the house when the bank broke. We had to get out, and I lost him. I called and called, but he didn't come." "I will go along and see if I can see him," said Grandfather. "Let me come too," said Roger. Rip will come if he hears me calling. All right, said Grandfather. Get your things on, Johnny. I will light the lanterns. Grandfather Yellowhat lit 3 lanterns. Johnny and Roger each took a lantern, and the 3 of them set out. It was still raining hard outside as they set off along the dark road. They had not gone far when they came to the water. The river was right over the road. Stop, Roger, said Grandfather. The water is too deep for us to go on. Rip, Roger called into the dark. Rip! But Rip did not come. We will look for him in the morning, Roger, said Grandfather. We must go back now. They turned back. Roger looked on one side of the road with his lantern, and Johnny looked on the other side. Rip! called Roger. Rip! But Rip still did not come, and they had to go in and go to bed. When they woke up in the morning, the rain had stopped. The sun was shining, and the sky was blue. The boys were soon up, and they set out with Jennifer to look for Rip. They went down the road towards the Red Hat's house until they came to the water. The river was still over the road. As they stood looking towards the house, Mr. Red Hat came out of the door. He had on some very big boots, and he came splashing along the road towards them. Was Rip there? asked Roger. Mr. Red Hat shook his head. No, he said, but Rip knows his way home. The river is going down. The water was not so high this morning. Did you stay in your house all night? asked Jennifer. Mr. Red Hat laughed. No, he said. I stayed at the Blue Hat's house, and I must get back, or I shall have Mrs. Blue Hat after me. He went on down the road. He won't like staying with Mrs. Blue Hat very much, said Johnny. Why not? asked Jennifer. You have to take your shoes off before you go into the house, said Johnny. Mr. Red Hat won't like that. On the way back to the Yellow Hat's house, they met the policeman. Have you seen Rip? asked Roger. Nope, said the policeman. I lost him last night, said Roger. I think he was frightened when the water came into the house, and he ran off. I'll keep a lookout for him, said the policeman. You put a notice in the village shop. Then everyone will know he is lost, and keep a lookout for him. They went into the house, and Roger made a big notice. Notice! Lost! A dog called Rip. If you find him, tell Roger Red Hat. They took the notice along to the shop and asked Mrs. Rigg, who lived there, if she would put it up. I'll put it where everyone can see it, Roger, she said. She put the notice in the shop window. Where shall we go now? Asked Roger. I don't want to go back yet. Let's go along the path by our house, said Johnny. We can see the floods from the hill. The water must be up to Mr. Brown's farm. They went along the path and up the hill and looked down towards the river. The river was up over its banks, but it was not as far as Mr. Brown's house. Mr. Brown was riding his horse, Ned. Look, said Jennifer. There is Ned. Some of the cows were standing in the water. Mr. Brown was out with his men, and he was riding Ned into the water. He had a rope in his hand. He tossed it over a cow's head. They're pulling the cows out, said Johnny. They stood looking on for some time, until Mr. Brown pulled the last cow out of the water. They were just turning to go back to the village when Jennifer cried, Roger! Look, Roger, look! A table was coming down the river, upside down, and on the table stood Rip. Rip! Cried Roger. Rip! Don't call him, said Johnny. He may jump into the water, and the river is running too fast for him to swim to us. "Mr. Brown! Mr. Brown!" cried Roger. But Mr. Brown was too far away to hear. "1, 2, 3, said Johnny. "Mr. Brown!" they all cried. Mr. Brown looked up. He saw Roger, and then he saw Rip on the table. He turned Ned back into the water, and as the table went by, he tossed his rope over one of its legs. Ned backed out of the water, and Mr. Brown pulled the table after him as if it had been a cow. As soon as the table was out of the water, they saw Rip jump off. Mr. Brown got off Ned, and Rip ran to him. Mr. Brown put Rip under one arm and got back on Ned again. Then he rode off towards the bridge. "Come on!" cried Roger. The two boys and Jennifer ran back to the road and along it towards the bridge as fast as they could run. When they got to the bridge, Mr. Brown was just coming out of the water on the far side, riding Ned. As soon as he saw Roger, Rip jumped right out of Mr. Brown's arms. He jumped with a big splash into the middle of a puddle and then ran towards Roger. When he was still a little way off, Rip jumped. He seemed to fly. He flew up, all wet and muddy as he was, right into Roger's arms.